We have some beautiful readings this morning that are saturated with one principal theme, and that's the theme of love, which makes perfect sense because, after all, God is love, and the essence of Christianity is love. And so our readings are saturated with love. The Old Testament reading has some very strong language employed to express that God has a particular love for those who are vulnerable, oppressed, and marginalized. The psalm, which is typically the response to some aspect, some theme in the Old Testament reading, continues this theme of love and makes it our response to God. I love you, Lord, my strength. Our response, in particular, if we ourselves are oppressed or marginalized or vulnerable, I love you, Lord, my strength. In the New Testament, the Thessalonians were moving from worship of idols after encountering Christ into loving service of God and His church. And in the gospel, we have perhaps the most succinct and concise statement of love in all the scriptures. The commandment, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so love saturates these readings, and so how can we not talk about love? And there are signs of love all around us. It is very easy to see. The signs of love of a young married couple, especially as they exchange their vows, just the way that they look at one another in this beautiful expression and affectionate love. Signs of love at St. Hilary Grade School with how the students develop in just loving kindness for one another in the way that they share, the way that they spend time with one another. In particular, classmates who might be forgotten or unseen, just this movement of love outward to include all of their classmates. Or signs of love in the beautiful testimony of a married couple that's been married for quite some time. The signs of love that were present in the good times and the bad, in sickness and in health. Or the signs of love in Father Steve and Father Cam, the times of setting aside important tasks or their own interest to go and anoint and be with our relatives and loved ones when they're sick or dying. We have all these beautiful testimonies of love, and perhaps we can even recognize, hopefully we can recognize in ourselves testimonies and signs of our love too, our love for one another and for God. But what happens when life changes? Does and can love stay the same? Our psalm response, I love you, Lord, my strength, is Psalm 18. Only 4 psalms later, in Psalm 22, we hear, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's David's calling out to the Lord when Saul was actively seeking his life. It's just 4 psalms later, this change in David's life that occurred. So what happens to love when life changes? I would like to suggest that when life changes around us, we intensify our love. When life changes around us, we intensify our love. This intensification, this call, it is rooted in the gospel because Jesus is commanding a very intense love. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's not a mere trite statement. It demands much. And so our response in this love has to be full, has to be intense, especially when life changes around us, in both the good and the bad changes. As life moves and progresses, we're called to change too. A beautiful example of this in the second reading, where the Thessalonians, embracing Christ, moved from their worship of idols and intensifying their love for one another and for the Lord, moved into loving service. And St. Paul commends them for that. I think it's important to note, especially when life changes, when life gets difficult, when we don't feel happiness or we don't feel good, that love is more than just a feeling. St. John Paul II says that it is an act of the will that consists in preferring in a constant manner the good of the other to our own good. And so there's something profound and powerful about love. And we're called to love in spite of what's going on around us. And so the gospel challenges us of loving God and loving the other when we don't feel like it, when things aren't going well. St. Ignatius of Loyola, the spiritual master that he is, in his discernment principles, he recommends that when there's dryness, when there's difficulty, not to change how we pray, or not to change the amount, not to change how we pray, but rather to change our response to things. To spend a little longer in prayer, one extra minute, to intensify that love for the Lord in prayer, to perform greater acts of service and more acts of service, a little bit of intensification. With the signs of love that are all around us, signs of love that we see, that young couple, just a beautiful, affectionate love as they exchange vows. What happens when they have their first child? Maybe there's less time for one another. Life changes, but love intensifies in seeing and experiencing the other become a father or become a mother, and just experiencing and intensifying love as a result. Life changed and love intensified. Or the witness of the St. Hilary Grade School, where a few weeks back a beloved teacher, Mrs. Kovarik, passed away. In the response of love in support for one another, especially the students who had her, in support of the other teachers, especially those who taught with her, and the celebrating her life. Life changed and love intensified. Or that same experienced married couple who, in the good times and the bad, in the sickness and the health, through children or maybe through infertility, through prosperity and financial security, or maybe through periods of unemployment and worry, yet there was that fidelity and that loving and honoring the other. Life changed and love intensified. Or Father Steve and Father Cam, I'm told that when one begins priestly ministry, there's this honeymoon stage where everything is exciting, everything is new, including 3 a.m. Calls to go and anoint someone. There's an excitement to get up and to exercise priestly ministry. But what happens when that honeymoon wears off and that 3 a.m. wake-up call isn't so exciting? The loving response of getting up and going to anoint and to be with our relatives, our family members who are dying. Life changed and love intensified. This weekend is Priesthood Sunday, and so all the other seminarians are out at various parishes sharing their vocation stories. And maybe you've heard some aspects of my own vocation story. My mom can tell it very well, my dad can tell it very well, and so I don't want to dwell on the story too much, in particular the story of what led me into the seminary, but rather I want to focus on a specific aspect of things that maybe you don't know as much: the interior transformation. I remember that when I was applying to the seminary, Bishop Lennon asked me why I wanted to be a priest. And my response was to bring Jesus to the people and to bring the people to Jesus. A beautiful desire. But there was a period of time in the seminary, for 3 years in particular, where I just didn't really have much of a consolation, have much of a desire for priesthood. Things weren't really making sense. I was in the seminary and I knew that the Lord wanted me to be there, but there wasn't this consolation about being there. There wasn't this peace. And during that time, I heard this profound quote from a very respected priest in the Diocese of Cleveland. He said that a priest has a front row seat to the theater of God's grace. And I took that quote and I held on to it because I loved people, and maybe this love for others was something that I could hold on to and grasp onto as this interior struggle about consolation was going on. Now, if you ask me about why I want to be a priest, my response is that I believe Jesus has made my heart to love in this way, and that he wants me to serve him and others as a priest. And I desire to love how Jesus made me to love. Life changed and love intensified. And I know with certainty that my motivations and desires will change anew, especially in, God willing, a year and a half, I become ordained a priest, and that my desires will adapt and change. And that's a good thing, because life will change and love will hopefully intensify. And so we have these beautiful signs and witnesses of love in the midst of change, both the change that's good and the change that's not so good. And I imagine if we reflect, all of us can see where and how in our own lives, when things have changed, when life has changed, our love and our loving response to God and others has intensified. And so I encourage continual reflection on that. And we're also afforded the opportunity, especially as we hear the word proclaimed, especially as we approach the altar, as we approach the Eucharistic sacrament, as we approach the one who saturates us with love, the one who draws us into deep, loving communion with us, who draws us upward to the heights, who is the very source and the summit of intense love. We have a model, we have an icon, we have the source, we have him who is intense love himself.